Based on an analysis of technological, environmental, geopolitical, and socio-cultural trends from 2025 to 2045, the article demonstrates that the contemporary world is moving not toward global unification, but toward the formation of a multipolar structure composed of regional blocks and hybrid governance models. Predicted tipping points, technological breakthroughs, climate crises, social transformations, and regional conflicts intensify fragmentation and highlight the structural limits of any universalist project. Philosophically, the article argues that universality remains in the realm of the ideal, guiding human action but not embodied in history in its final form. Politically, this signifies a shift from global universalism to regional universalism based on adaptation, compromise, and resilience. The author proposes a conceptual framework explaining the 21st century world order as a dynamic system in which stability is achieved not through unification, but through diversity, balance, and the recognition of limits. The Limits of Universalism: Scenarios Beyond the End of History. By OpenAI. Any doctrine that claims universal validity, whether liberal, Marxist, technocratic, or civilizational, assumes that a single normative and institutional framework can encompass the full diversity of human societies. Yet the intellectual currents that emerged in the late 20th century, particularly postmodernism, critical theory, and structuralism, reveal deep conceptual limits to such universalist claims. Their arguments do not merely reject specific universal ideologies, they demonstrate that universalism as such is structurally impossible in the human world. Postmodern thought, from Lyotard to Derrida, destabilizes universalist grand narratives by showing that they rely on hidden exclusions, suppressed alternatives, and metaphysical assumptions that cannot withstand scrutiny. Universal order presupposes a unified horizon of meaning, one language of reason capable of adjudicating all differences. Yet postmodern thinkers insist that meaning is irreducibly plural, dependent on the play of linguistic differences and embedded in localized contexts of life. Thus, every claim to universal rationality masks a contingent cultural perspective elevated to the status of necessity. Liberalism, socialism, or any other universalizing discourse functions not as a transparent description of reality but as a language game whose internal coherence depends on ignoring the multiplicity of other possible games. Critical theory develops this critique further by demonstrating that universal norms of morality, rights, or justice do not float above society but are produced within specific configurations of power. As Adorno and Horkheimer argue, Enlightenment universalism conceals its own self-interested genealogy. What appears as reason in its universal form often serves as an ideological cover for domination. The universalization of a normative order, whether expressed as civilization, progress, or human rights, can function as the extension of a particular cultural logic, ultimately reinforcing inequalities rather than dissolving them. Universalism, therefore, is not simply naive. It is a political practice that transforms particular interests into the appearance of objective necessity. Structuralism adds yet another layer to this critique. For Lévi-Strauss, Foucault, Althusser, and others, human societies are constituted by deep structures, linguistic, symbolic, institutional, that shape the conditions of meaning and action. These structures differ radically across cultures and historical periods, and they cannot be reduced to a single scheme of organization. The universalist assumption that all societies can be reconfigured according to one normative blueprint ignores the structural heterogeneity that forms the basis of cultural life. Governance, law, and social organization do not manifest universal principles. They materialize through specific practices embedded in particular symbolic orders. Power itself loses its universality. It operates not as a monolithic force but as a configuration whose efficacy depends on historical context. Institutions that function effectively in one structural matrix lose coherence when transplanted into another. Thus universalism fails not because it is morally objectionable, but because it is structurally impossible. Moreover, the postmodern, critical theoretical, and structuralist perspectives converge on a single key point. Universalism collapses at the point where language, culture, and power reassert their particularity. Universalist ideologies assume that the human subject is fundamentally the same everywhere, possessing identical desires, rational capacities, and moral intuitions. Yet the formation of subjectivity itself is mediated by the structures of meaning that differ from one society to another. Freedom, morality, and order are not abstract universals but interpretations shaped by cultural codes. What appears as freedom in one context may signify dissolution or disorder in another. What one society considers moral progress may appear as sacrilege or nihilism elsewhere. These are not superficial disagreements but deep ontological divergences rooted in incompatible symbolic grammars. From this perspective, the universalist vision of Koyave and Fukuyama, where a single model of rational liberal order becomes the end point of human development, reveals its own metaphysical naivete. It presupposes that liberal rationality reflects the universal human condition, whereas postmodern and structuralist critiques show that such rationality is itself a parochial cultural artifact. It takes the grammar of one civilization, elevates it to a general anthropology, and declares it the telos of history. But history is not a teleological march toward conceptual closure. It is a field of intersecting cultural trajectories, each shaped by structural constraints that resist assimilation. Thus the limit to universalism is not geopolitical rivalry or ideological resistance alone, although these play a role. The far deeper and more intractable limit is ontological. Human life unfolds through structures of meaning that cannot be rendered commensurable without destroying the cultures that embody them. Universalism, when fully realized, would erase the plurality of worlds in which human existence can take shape. Its failure, therefore, is not a contingent historical accident but an expression of the irreducible heterogeneity of human reality. The first decades of the 21st century have brought into sharp relief a deep conceptual crisis within political thought, the problem of universality. Secular doctrines such as liberalism, socialism, nationalism, and globalism continue to present themselves as systems of universal validity. Yet their claims increasingly collide with the empirical and metaphysical limits of the world they seek to order. If the 20th century still nourished the belief that politics might culminate in a final system, the 21st has instead revealed the fragility and contingency of all worldly orders. For even the most powerful doctrines operate within structures of scarcity, difference, and conflict that they cannot abolish. In this context, the contributions of two major philosophical figures, Peter Sloterdijk and Simon Critchley, offer particularly illuminating insights. Sloterdijk's theory of co-immunity reframes political communities as cooperative immunological spheres defined by shared vulnerabilities and protective infrastructures. While Critchley's concept of mystical anarchism insists on the irreducibility of transcendence and the ethical insufficiency of all worldly powers. Sloterdijk exposes the material, anthropotechnical, and infrastructural conditions of human coexistence. Critchley insists upon the ethical, theological, and apophatic dimension that secular politics cannot suppress. Together their thought illuminates a single crucial truth. Every secular doctrine is both immunologically bounded and theologically grounded. The ambition of the present essay is to show that a synthesis of Sloterdijk and Critchley not only deepens our understanding of political modernity but also provides a conceptual path toward a new Westphalian peace in Eurasia. One capable of reconciling rival civilizations whose universalist claims have become mutually destructive. The task is not to impose a new universal doctrine but to articulate a framework within which multiple immunological orders can coexist under the horizon of a transcendence that none of them can fully appropriate. Modernity has long been animated by the conviction that political orders can achieve universal scope. The liberal faith in human rights, the socialist faith in class emancipation, and the globalist faith in economic integration all repeat a structural pattern inherited from theology. The aspiration to transcend contingency and achieve a final, comprehensive order. Yet none of these systems can escape the finitude inherent in their worldly nature. Three structural limits define the horizon of secular universalism. First, every doctrine is embedded within historical specificity. Liberalism emerged from the Anglo-Atlantic world, socialism from industrial Europe, national sovereignty from early modern territorial monarchies. The Universalist claims mask parochial origins. Second, doctrines function as immunological systems in Sloterdijk's sense. They organize protective spheres against threat and contingency. A system oriented toward survival cannot also become absolute, because immunity presupposes boundaries, and boundaries contradict universality. Third, every secular doctrine ultimately relies on a theological archetype that it can never fully embody: providence, redemption, reconciliation, or eschatological peace. The absolute belongs to transcendence, the worldly order is a finite imitation. This point, central to Critchley, prevents secular systems from stabilizing themselves through total immanence. Modernity thus oscillates between theological aspiration and worldly limitation. The failure of the end of history was not merely geopolitical, it was metaphysical. It rested on the mistaken belief that a finite system could enact an infinite horizon. Sloterdijk and Critchley together reveal why such attempts repeatedly collapse. Universality is an immunological impossibility, yet it persists as an ethical and theological aspiration that the world can never satisfy. Their intersection permits a new theory according to which secular universalism is inherently relative because its theological archetype is transcendent and cannot be materialized. Sloterdijk's political philosophy begins from the simple yet profound observation that to be human is to share vulnerability. This shared vulnerability generates the need for protective spheres: familial, urban, religious, national, civilizational. Immunological logic is the architecture of coexistence. Cultures are not primarily systems of meaning but systems of protection, and myths, institutions, technologies, and rituals are all forms of immunological design. Sloterdijk's key claim is that modernity has pushed immunological systems to a breaking point. Traditional immunities, religion, law, the territorial state, are no longer adequate to the scale of global danger. At the same time, the expansion of sovereignty provokes autoimmunity, the tendency of protective systems to generate threats to themselves. In response, Sloterdijk proposes the concept of co-immunity, a shared immunological structure grounded in recognition of mutual dependence. Co-immunity does not entail ideological uniformity but structural interdependence. Communities preserve themselves by participating in a broader network of protective relations. The relational, material, and plural character of co-immunity defines Sloterdijk's alternative to universalist ideologies. Political order is reconceived not as the imposition of a normative absolute but as the art of immunological coexistence. Yet this immunological account alone cannot ground ethical legitimacy, because such systems remain worldly and bounded. They require an external horizon, a regulative ideal that prevents them from becoming idolatrous. Here Critchley's contribution becomes indispensable. For Critchley, politics cannot be detached from the irreducible presence of an ethical demand that exceeds all worldly powers. His mystical anarchism is not a program of institutional dissolution but an orientation toward the transcendent ethical call that no political authority can satisfy. The state, in Critchley's view, cannot ground ethics, for the state operates through power, order, and necessity, whereas ethics emerges from the infinite responsibility one person bears toward another. This ethical excess is rooted in the theological dimension. Mystical anarchism inherits the apophatic tradition in which God is not a being among beings but a hypertranscendent horizon before which all worldly arrangements appear finite. The point is not confessional theology but philosophical humility. Politics must remain open to this infinite horizon. Any claim to finality, whether liberal, socialist, nationalist, or globalist, is idolatrous in the precise sense that it attempts to substitute a worldly form for the infinite demand grounding ethical life. Mystical anarchism therefore calls for political institutions that are functional yet consciously incomplete, coherent yet humble. Sloterdijk supplies the structural conditions for coexistence. Critchley supplies the ethical limit that prevents these structures from collapsing into new absolutes. The synthesis of their thought yields a crucial theoretical insight. Every secular doctrine is an immune sphere whose justification is theological in origin yet whose authority is structurally bounded. Liberalism and socialism, for instance, cannot claim universal validity because they arise from particular historical immunological conditions. Their universalist pretensions reflect theological inheritances. Liberalism inherits the Christian idea of universal equality before God. Socialism inherits the eschatological ideal of final justice. Globalism inherits the theological idea of providential. These are transformations rather than actualizations of theological archetypes, and because the worldly order is always finite, their theological aspirations remain unfulfilled. Secular doctrines thus function as ideals rather than realities. They orient human action but do not constitute the final order of life. Modernity becomes understandable as the proliferation of finite immunological spheres attempting to enact infinite theological archetypes that they cannot realize. Sloterdijk accounts for the finitude of these structures. Critchley accounts for their orientation toward the infinite. Their intersection furnishes a conceptual framework for explaining the failure of universalism without dismissing the ethical horizon that motivates it. This model proves especially suited to illuminating the ongoing Eurasian crisis. The geopolitical conflict across Eurasia arises from the collision of competing universalist claims, each aspiring to ground regional order in a doctrine imagined to possess universal authority. The West presents liberal democracy as the universally valid form of political life. Russia asserts civilizational sovereignty as a universally legitimate principle. Smaller states assert nationalism as universally authoritative. China advances developmental technocracy as a universally applicable model. Each position rests upon a transformed theological archetype. Each imagines itself the bearer of the universal. Each is, in fact, an immunological sphere shaped by local histories, material conditions, and structural vulnerabilities. The conflict arises not from antagonism alone but from the misrecognition of finitude as universality. When every actor claims the absolute, confrontation is inevitable. Sloterdijk clarifies why these universalist claims are structurally impossible. Critchley clarifies why they persist, animated by the lure of transcendence that worldly orders cannot realize. The Eurasian impasse is therefore not merely geopolitical but metaphysical, requiring not a victory but a philosophical de-escalation, a recognition that no doctrine can occupy the place of the absolute. Only such recognition can open the way toward a renewed settlement. A new Westphalia for Eurasia would echo the logic of the 17th century settlement that ended the wars of religion by acknowledging that multiple authorities could coexist so long as none claimed to embody the entire truth. Then, the relocation of transcendence from state to conscience made peaceful plurality possible. Now, an analogous relocation is required. Doctrinal humility must replace universalist ambition. Sloterdijk's notion of co-immunity provides the structural basis of this order by emphasizing shared vulnerabilities, ecological, economic, technological, demographic, that no Eurasian actor can escape. Co-immunity replaces domination with interdependence, immunity with co-immunity, sovereignty with compatibilities. At the same time, Critchley's mystical anarchism furnishes the ethical foundation for such coexistence. It demands that political actors renounce claims to the absolute and accept their finitude before a transcendent horizon. This is not relativism but metaphysical humility. States cease to pose as bearers of universal truth and become custodians of finite, historically formed immunological spheres. Eurasian peace thus arises when interdependence is accepted structurally and metaphysical humility accepted ethically. It is a peace grounded neither in victory nor in enforced integration but in the recognition that political forms are finite, that universality belongs to transcendence, and that peaceful coexistence requires both cooperation and restraint. The synthesis of Sloterdijk's co-immunity and Critchley's mystical anarchism finally reveals a new way of understanding political life in the 21st century. It rejects both cynical realism and utopian idealism. It demands ethical seriousness without metaphysical naivety, political plurality without relativistic collapse. Universality belongs to the transcendent realm rather than the worldly. Secular doctrines can approximate but never realize it. Political order must therefore be structured immunologically rather than grounded metaphysically. Co-immunity, not universalism, furnishes the basis of peaceful coexistence. Ethical legitimacy requires mystical humility rather than ideological confidence, for mystical anarchism prevents the immunological sphere from becoming idolatrous. In such a framework, Eurasian peace becomes conceivable not merely as a geopolitical arrangement but as a philosophical necessity. The reconciliation of East and West hinges not on domination or synthesis but on the shared recognition that the universal lies beyond them both. The absolute cannot be incarnated in a state, a civilization, a doctrine, or a historical project, and it is precisely this impossibility that opens the space for coexistence. By integrating Sloterdijk and Critchley, we recover a truth long forgotten by political philosophy. The world is finite, yet the human orientation toward the infinite endures, and it is this tension rather than its denial that makes peace possible. If the synthesis of Sloterdijk and Critchley reveals that universality, in its strictest sense, belongs to the transcendent realm and cannot be realized within the immunological and ethically finite structures of the world, then the contemporary geopolitical landscape may be understood as the empirical unfolding of this metaphysical truth. The failure of secular doctrines to achieve genuine universality is not merely a philosophical proposition but an observable condition of global politics. What appears, at first glance, as the political fragmentation of the early 21st century is in fact the historical manifestation of the structural limits inherent in all worldly orders. They aspire toward universality through inherited theological archetypes, yet they remain confined to the finite materiality of their own immunological spheres. It is precisely here that the discourse on the end of history, formulated by Alexandre Koyave and popularized by Francis Fukuyama, re-enters the philosophical stage. For the supposed culmination of political development in a liberal democratic order represents the most elaborate attempt to translate a theological archetype, eschatological reconciliation, into an immanent secular form. The vision of the last man, satisfied, pacified, and dwelling in a stable horizon of universal norms, reflects not simply an empirical prognosis but a metaphysical aspiration that the finite world cannot sustain. The Sloterdijk-Critchley synthesis makes clear why such a project was always destined to encounter limits. Liberal universalism, like every secular doctrine, operates simultaneously as an immune system and as a displaced theological ideal. It must claim universality in order to function as a horizon, yet its structural finitude prevents that claim from becoming reality. Consequently, the unraveling of the post-Cold War liberal order should not be interpreted merely as a geopolitical failure, a strategic miscalculation, or an institutional deficit. It is the dialectical correction demanded by the world's intrinsic finitude. When political systems attempt to occupy the place of the absolute, they inevitably encounter the counterforce of contingency, plurality, and limit. Sloterdijk explains this through the concept of immunological boundaries. A system that expands beyond its protective sphere generates autoimmunity. Critchley explains it through the impossibility of collapsing the infinite ethical demand into any worldly form. Both point to a simple but profound conclusion. History cannot end because no finite political form can absorb or exhaust the transcendent pull of the universal. What now emerges is a striking alignment between philosophical diagnosis and empirical reality. The return of multipolarity, the assertion of regional civilizational models, the fragmentation of global governance, and the resurgence of ideological plurality are not temporary deviations from a universal trajectory, but expressions of the structural impossibility of secular universalism. They represent, in historical form, the very limits that the Sloterdijk-Critchley framework describes at the conceptual level. The world is thus entering not a post-historical calm but a new epoch in which universalism survives only as an orienting ideal, guiding human action without incarnating itself in any single global order. It is against this theoretical background that a detailed analysis of contemporary processes, technological, ecological, demographic, and geopolitical, must proceed. For these processes do not merely illustrate the limits of secular universalism, they constitute the material conditions through which these limits become visible. They show how technological shocks, environmental pressures, social transformations, and regional conflicts interact to produce a structurally multipolar world, in which universal norms persist only as transcendent ideals rather than as realized political forms. In this sense, the empirical analysis of the decades ahead, from technological breakthroughs and ecological tipping points to geopolitical confrontations and cultural reconfigurations, confirms the deeper insight that the striving for universalism is inherent to human action, while the attainment of universality lies beyond the world. What follows, therefore, is not a departure from the philosophical argument but its continuation on the plane of historical prognosis. The transition from the conceptual synthesis of Sloterdijk and Critchley to the empirical analysis of global trajectories represents the movement from the abstract recognition of finitude to the concrete demonstration of its effects. The limits of universalism appear not only in theory but in the very unfolding of the 21st century. The question is no longer whether the universal can be realized, but how civilizations navigate a world in which universality persists only as an aspirational horizon. A guiding ideal that shapes political imagination while forever eluding complete embodiment. The world of the 21st century increasingly demonstrates that historical processes are structured not by convergence toward a single culmination, but by continual movement between expansion, limit, crisis, and reconfiguration. What emerges is not closure, but a pattern of cyclicality, differentiation, and adaptive equilibrium. Seen from this perspective, the failures of linear universalism are not anomalies but expressions of the deeper principle that no finite system can secure the sovereignty of the universal. Globalization, technological modernization, and liberal democratic expansion were never capable of overcoming the structural boundaries of the world. They could only approximate the ideal through partial, temporary, and regionally conditioned forms. As soon as the project of liberal universalism encountered ecological constraints, geopolitical pluralism, technological asymmetry, and demographic divergence, its limitations became increasingly visible. The recognition that secular universalism is structurally incapable of achieving full realization because it lacks access to the transcendent ground that alone can sustain genuine universality provides a crucial interpretive lens for assessing contemporary global dynamics. If universality properly belongs to the realm of the ideal, then every worldly attempt to embody it will necessarily confront limits arising from material constraints, cultural multiplicity, historical contingency, and institutional finitude. This does not invalidate universalist aspirations, rather, it places them within the proper ontological register. They guide and motivate, but they do not consummate themselves in history. With this framework in place, the Koyave-Fukuyama thesis appears not so much incorrect as missituated. It confuses the regulative ideal with the empirical trajectory of global politics, mistaking the motivational horizon of liberal modernity for its imminent destiny. The end of history thus reflects a theological impulse displaced into the secular domain, the hope that a final and comprehensive order might emerge within the confines of the political. This philosophical insight opens the way to a more empirically grounded analysis of 21st century transformations. Once we recognize the intrinsic limits of universality in secular forms, the major trends of our era, multipolarization, regionalization, institutional fragmentation, and the emergence of autonomous civilizational blocs, appear not as deviations from an expected path, but as natural outcomes of a world where universal ideals encounter the finite nature of human societies. What follows is an examination of how these limits manifest themselves through technological shocks, ecological pressures, geopolitical competition, and socio-cultural transformations. Together, these dynamics illustrate why the Koyave-Fukuyama conception fails to describe the present and why a framework grounded in the limits of universalism offers a more adequate account of global change. The notion of the end of history, formulated by Alexandre Koyave and later adapted by Francis Fukuyama, posits that liberal democracy and market capitalism constitute the final form of human political economic organization, culminating in the triumph of the last man. According to this vision, global liberalism would universalize human desires within a stable framework, effectively resolving ideological conflict and achieving historical closure. Yet, the 21st century demonstrates that such linear universalism fails to capture the dynamic complexity of contemporary global affairs. Political, economic, and cultural processes indicate the persistent presence of limits to secular universalism, arising both from structural contingencies and from the intrinsic finitude of worldly systems. Each secular doctrine, liberalism, socialism, or globalization theory, bears the imprint of a theological archetype, an aspiration toward universal harmony, justice, or order. Unlike the absolute, which in classical theology possesses genuine universality in the transcendent realm, worldly systems are finite, contingent, and inherently imperfect. They are embedded in structures of conflict, scarcity, and historical limitation. Consequently, any claim to universal applicability in secular doctrines is necessarily conditional, partial, and context-dependent. Universalism functions not as an accomplished reality but as an orienting ideal. It motivates action, shapes institutions, and provides a normative horizon, yet it remains intrinsically unattainable. The liberal model, for example, acts as a catalyst for progress toward an ideal of universality rather than as a vehicle for its realization. This perspective reframes the end of history not as historical closure but as a philosophical aspiration that guides human effort. Over the coming decades, multiple interrelated dynamics underscore the limits of secular universalism. Technological innovation, particularly breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, energy, and biotechnology, will redistribute global economic and political power asymmetrically. By 2026 to 2028, regional digital sovereignty and independent technological ecosystems will emerge, particularly in Eurasia, South America, and parts of Asia, reducing the influence of previously dominant global institutions. Simultaneously, ecological crises manifested in droughts, floods, and resource scarcity between 2027 and 2035 will compel states to prioritize regional stability and resilience over universalist ambitions. Social transformations, ranging from mass mobilizations to ideological shifts between 2032 and 2040, will further fragment political and cultural cohesion, producing hybrid governance structures that combine local traditions with technological and institutional innovation. Across these tipping points, universality manifests as an orienting ideal rather than a realized condition. By 2035 to 2045, these dynamics will likely produce a multipolar world order. Autonomous regional blocks, Eurasian, African, South American, North American, and partially Chinese, will govern themselves according to localized norms, while inter-block competition and cultural heterogeneity will persist. The contemporary global reality of the 21st century demonstrates that the idea of the end of history, formulated by Alexandre Koyave and later adapted by Francis Fukuyama, proves insufficient for accurately describing the dynamics of international relations and civilizational development. The universalist conception, according to which liberal democracy and market economies constitute the final form of political economic systems, and the last man satisfies his needs and stagnates within the framework of the global liberal order, largely reflected the ideological and political conjuncture of the 1990s. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the defeat of communist systems, it seemed that the victory of the West was permanently secured and that humanity was moving toward global unification, in which cultural and political differences would be leveled and international conflicts minimized. Yet, already in the 21st century, signs are emerging that this linear and finalized model of universalism not only fails to materialize on a global scale but also confronts systemic limits that cannot be overcome by merely expanding the liberal order. Contemporary political, economic, and cultural processes indicate a decline in the appeal of the liberal model, particularly among the youth in G20 countries. While authoritarian and semi-authoritarian regimes maintain stability and even expand their influence, economic activity centers are gradually shifting from traditional Western countries to regions of Eurasia and the Global South, intensifying competition and redistributing economic weight. While global institutions that once acted as arbiters of universal norms are losing effectiveness, trends of protectionism, regionalization of supply chains, and the fragmentation of the global economy demonstrate that the previous form of globalization is becoming unstable, and geopolitical competition is re-emerging in new forms. Technological, demographic, and ecological challenges, including resource depletion, aging populations in developed countries, and population growth in poorer regions, exert increasing pressure on global institutions and highlight the limits of universalism. Over the next 20 years, the world is expected to develop according to cycles of expansion, limit, compromise, manifested through specific events and crises that can be considered tipping points. The first critical point is the technological shock. Should a sudden breakthrough in energy, artificial intelligence, or biotechnology occur between 2025 and 2030, it could redistribute economic and political power on a global scale. In a scenario of evenly distributed technological adoption, globalization and the universalization of economic and institutional models could intensify. However, a more likely scenario is regional asymmetry. Wealthy countries with established technological infrastructure gain advantage, while poorer regions remain peripheral and are forced to develop autonomous systems. This leads to increased multipolarity, where global universalism encounters technological and institutional limits. Between 2026 and 2028, the technological shock is likely to manifest as a growth in digital sovereignty and the creation of regional technological blocs. China, India, Middle Eastern countries, and South America will develop their own digital ecosystems, reducing the effectiveness of global institutions such as the UN and the World Bank as universal arbiters. This will necessitate regional compromises and reinforce multi-level power centers. Here, Koyuve-Fukuyama universalism fails to materialize because technological expansion encounters cultural and institutional boundaries. The second critical point is the ecological and climate crisis, which will likely intensify between 2027 and 2035 through widespread droughts, floods, and freshwater shortages. States will be pressured to redistribute resources, limit migration, and increase control over strategically important areas. In Africa and South Asia, environmental constraints will drive local conflicts and stimulate the formation of autonomous regional alliances. In Europe and North America, resource pressures will accelerate regulation and reform of energy infrastructure to maintain resilience. These developments demonstrate the limits of global universalism through objective biophysical constraints. No ideological construct can override the fundamental boundaries of the natural environment. The third critical point is geopolitical confrontation among major powers or alliances, likely between 2030 and 2038. Local conflicts arising from technological and ecological asymmetries could escalate into large-scale regional crises. If conflicts remain limited and successful mediation occurs, new cycles of compromise may emerge, redistributing the balance of power while preserving relative global stability. In the case of escalation, international institutions may be undermined, regional power centers strengthened, and governance increasingly authoritarian. These developments confirm the limits of universalism in the political sphere. Global liberal models lose appeal, yielding to adaptive and localized governance systems. The fourth critical point relates to socio-cultural transformations, occurring roughly between 2032 and 2040. Mass movements, revolutions, or ideological shifts can alter governance structures and societal institutions, especially in countries experiencing high social tension. If these transformations are integrated into institutional mechanisms, hybrid systems may emerge, combining local traditions with technological and administrative innovations. Uncontrolled social dynamics, however, increase the risk of conflict and regional fragmentation. Here, the cultural and cognitive limits of universalism are particularly evident. Ideological unification is impossible without accounting for the deep-seated differences and traditions of societies. A notable feature of scenario analysis is the interconnection of these tipping points. Technological shocks can accelerate ecological crises, while social transformations may intensify geopolitical conflicts. For instance, by 2035, an energy technology revolution in Southeast Asia could exacerbate economic inequality, heighten social tensions, and provoke resource conflicts. Simultaneously, ecological constraints in Europe and North America will drive accelerated, green, economic integration, creating competitive advantages for regions that adapt effectively. Thus, the limits of universalism manifest not as isolated factors but as interconnected elements within a complex system. Scenarios for 2035 to 2045 indicate the formation of a new multipolar world order. Regional blocs, Eurasian, African, South American, North American, and partially Chinese, will develop autonomous governance, economic, and security systems. Within these blocks, harmonization of rules and standards may occur, but competition, technological asymmetry, and cultural diversity will persist between blocks. Global universalism will prove impossible, yet regional universalism will emerge as a key mechanism of resilience. This process affirms the concept of the limits of universalism. Global integration encounters insurmountable constraints, and balance is achieved through compromise and adaptation. Philosophically, this confirms the notion of historical cyclicality and the necessity of recognizing limits. Universalism as a project has boundaries, and any attempt to impose a single model globally inevitably confronts resistance, crises, and redistribution of power centers. History continues not linearly but through cycles of expansion, confrontation with limits, and adaptive compromise. Stability is achieved through balance, recognition of constraints, and adaptability rather than through the triumph of a single model or the creation of global uniformity. The analysis of scenarios for 2025 to 2045 shows that Koyuve Fukuyama's "end of history" does not align with observable trends. Universalism, in its linear form, fails to materialize. The world develops through multipolarity, regional compromises, technological and ecological constraints, and cultural fragmentation. Balance of power and adaptive resilience become central mechanisms for the survival of civilizations. The philosophical and practical model of the limits of universalism proves more adequate and viable, as it accounts for real constraints and the diversity of factors influencing the global order. A year-by-year forecast illustrates the development of these processes. From 2025 to 2028, technological shocks and growing digital sovereignty create regional technological blocks. From 2027 to 2035, ecological crises force resource redistribution and heightened control measures. From 2030 to 2038, geopolitical competition may escalate into localized conflicts with potential for large-scale escalation. From 2032 to 2040, socio-cultural transformations exert pressure on governance institutions and societal values. By 2035 to 2045, a new multipolar order emerges, where resilience is ensured through compromise, adaptation, and recognition of diversity rather than global unification. In sum, the modern world demonstrates that the limits of universalism are evident across technological, ecological, geopolitical, and cultural dimensions. Civilizations and political systems learn to interact without imposing full unification, forming a stable yet dynamic global structure. The concept of the limits of universalism connects philosophical thought with the practical realities of the 21st century, providing a framework for forecasting, analysis, and strategic planning. It shows that stability and survival are ensured through diversity and compromise rather than linear expansion of a single model. This approach remains the most adequate for understanding the dynamics of the global order and for guiding policy in a world characterized by uncertainty and the complex interconnection of factors. The secular universalist project fails to achieve global unification, yet regional forms of universalism, oriented toward resilience and adaptive governance, will emerge as functional approximations of the transcendent ideal. Here, the philosophical principle is clear. Universality properly belongs to the ideal, to the transcendent realm, and worldly systems are instruments for approximating it. Their role is not to realize absolute perfection but to motivate human action, providing direction and coherence in complex, contingent contexts. This framework has significant implications for political philosophy and international relations. First, it challenges the linear conception of historical teleology by demonstrating the persistent multiplicity of centers of power and the interdependence of technological, ecological, and social variables. Second, it emphasizes the role of ideals as motivational constructs, distinct from practical outcomes, underscoring that stability and cooperation emerge through negotiation, compromise, and adaptive strategies rather than through the imposition of a singular universal model. Finally, it provides a normative lens for understanding the role of secular doctrines in global politics. They function as approximations of the transcendent ideal, guiding action without claiming to fully realize universality. In conclusion, contemporary global politics confirms that secular universalism is intrinsically limited. The liberal democratic model, while influential, cannot fully actualize universal norms, just as other ideological systems encounter structural and cultural constraints. The transcendent ideal of universality, whether conceived theologically or philosophically, serves as the true locus of universality, motivating action, shaping institutions, and orienting strategic planning. Recognizing the distinction between achievable worldly outcomes and the guiding ideal allows for a more nuanced understanding of global dynamics, providing a framework for multipolar governance, adaptive resilience, and sustainable interaction among civilizations. Stability and progress are thus achieved not through the imposition of a singular universal system but through pluralism, compromise, and the pursuit of an aspirational horizon that remains forever beyond complete attainment.